Today is the seventh Sabbath in a cycle of 7. I sometimes think we really don't give enough attention to the intervening days between the Passover and Pentecost. They are, in most of our minds, really two very separate entities or institutions. And we think about Passover, we then think Pentecost is coming, but the intervening weeks, days, the count, as it were, because God says, you shall count unto you from the morrow after the Sabbath, when you offer the wave sheaf offering. You shall count unto you 50 days, or 49 days really, 7 times 7. 7 Sabbaths, he said, shall be complete unto you. Until the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall you number 50 days, and then that day will be a festival. It's called the Feast of Weeks. It's called the Feast of First Fruits. In the New Testament, it's called the Feast of the 50th Day, which in Greek, 50th is Pentecost. So it's the Feast of the Pentecost Day, where the name comes from. So some people do, a few of us have over the years, most of us don't think about it, have counted down the days, especially have counted down the Sabbaths leading up to Pentecost. This is the 7th Sabbath. Today, 7 Sabbaths are complete. Now, I think you all probably know that Pentecost is a harvest festival, that the barley harvest could not begin in Israel until the day of the wave sheaf. That is the day that we believe Christ was presented before the Father as the first fruits from the dead. Israel was not allowed to eat any of the barley crop of this year until that wave sheaf had been offered. Then began 7 of the busiest weeks of the year, because between the day that first sheaf of barley was harvested and the time the entire grain crop was in was about 7 weeks. Now, whenever you have that type of an agricultural situation, that it's kind of, you work from sun up until sundown, or from can until can't, and by the time you can see until the time you can't see anymore. That harvest and harvest season in an agricultural community is a time of very hard, unceasing work. Now, in your lifetime, you probably have had some periods of time where you were in considerable pressure. You were in crisis, perhaps, as a ripe harvest that's coming up with storm clouds on the horizon is very much a crisis. You've been in situations to where there was more to do than you could ever get done. And like a farmer in harvest time, there is a powerful temptation to work every moment of every day, as long as you can, as much as you can, whenever you can see, till the point where you can't, until the body gives out and you have to take it to bed, to work, to work, to work. Now, the funny thing about this Pentecost season is, we weren't allowed to start this harvest until the day after a Sabbath. You had to have, before you started work, a day of rest. Then, the sheaf was cut at sundown. The next morning, it was go, man, go, until all the harvest was in. Well, no, it wasn't. It was go until the next Sabbath. And you could work 16 hours a day if you'd like. You can push yourself from sunup to sundown if you wish. But at the end of the 6th day, when the sun went down, you had to stop. Go home. Be with your wife. Be with your children. Get a good night's sleep. You might as well sleep in the morning, because there is no harvesting going to be going on. You can't even repair your tools. You can't do anything in terms of the work of the harvest. All you can do on this day is rest. Now, you understand that when we come to the New Testament, we begin to see the typology in the holy days and the harvest that connects with what we call the work of God. That is the spreading of the gospel, evangelizing, and then ministering to people, teaching people to observe all things that God has commanded us, even to the end of the age. And so that we actually see the work of Jesus Christ as a harvest of people. Jesus said, lift up your eyes to the harvest. It's white unto harvest. And the laborers are few. Pray that God will send more workers out here into the harvest. Now, the temptation, I think, just like it is for the farmer, is for those of us who have decided to put our hand to the plow in the service of our fellow man, in the church, in evangelism, in ministry, in helping, encouraging, and working. The temptation is to work, 16 hours a day, 7 days a week. And you know, I really believe, I'm always looking at the typology of the holy days, and I'm always wondering what else there is there. And I really believe that there is a lesson in each of these 7 Sabbaths, culminating in today. And the lesson is this. They tell us, these Sabbaths do, you cannot work all the time, even at God's work. There comes a time when you must pause, when you must stop, when you must reflect, when you must do nothing, when you should be silent, and when you should be alone with yourself and alone with God. There's a time, back in Mark the 6th chapter, and I want to begin reading to you in verse 7, because this is one of those occasions, this particular description of an occasion, Jesus sent the 12 out 2 by 2, actually to do their work. He sent 70 out on another occasion. On this occasion, if you could kind of put yourself in these men's position, it says in verse 7, he called to him the 12, and he began to send them forth 2 by 2. And he gave them power over unclean spirits, and he commanded them that they should take nothing for their journey but a staff, no scrip, no bread, and no money. They should be shod with sandals. They should not put on 2 coats. He said, in whatever place you enter into, the house, you stay there until you leave that place. Now, there is a certain tension, would you agree? In walking out of town, Jesus has sent you on your way. You don't have anything extra for you. You have your staff in your hand for walking. You got the sandals on your feet. You have the clothes on your back. You got no credit card, no letter of credit, no money, no silver, no bag. It's you and the gospel and nothing else. When you walk into a town down the road, what do you do first? Where do you go? I expect that was not too difficult for them in the sense that what they did was follow the example that Jesus followed. But they had to depend on the people where they went and where they preached to take care of them, to put them up. They didn't bring money with them. Somebody had to put them up. Somebody had to give them food. If they wore out their sandals, somebody had to give them a pair. If they tore their cloak, someone would have to either help them, give them something to mend it with, or they'd have to just go with the tear. They were totally dependent on the people that they were serving. He says in verse 11, whoever will not receive you or hear you when you leave there, shake off the dust from under your feet for a testimony against them. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city. I'm with you now. I'm going to back you in everything that you do, and you do this and I'll do that. And so they went out and they preached that men should repent. And they cast out many demons and anointed with oil many that were sick and healed them. Now, put yourself in their shoes. You're going from town to town, and I don't know how long they were out or how many towns they visited on their way, but here you are, and you go into the town and you preach, and you come upon a sick person. And you put out your hand, you take him by the hand, and you say, rise up and walk. And he stands up, looks at his legs, he can't believe it, and he is able to walk away from you. He's able to dance in the streets a little bit, as it were. He was healed. And you were the person whose hand he took and stood up. You were the person, you walk into the town and you run into this person who is so obviously demon-possessed that no one could make the mistake, and all of a sudden you just realize, I can cast that demon out, and you command it to leave, and it's gone. So they anointed sick people, and they got well. They cast out demons. They preached, and people repented. That to me is one of the most encouraging things that can ever happen. You preach a sermon, you preach from God's Word, and someone comes up with tears in their eyes and says, I'm ready to turn my life around. Do you have any idea, by the time these men reached the end of a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks or whatever period of time it was, how exalted they must have felt? You imagine the adrenaline that is with them as these things happen to them, how good they feel. I'll tell you, it's the strangest thing, and I did not really quite expect it. But the high point of my week is doing the radio broadcast. And when I leave the studio at the end of a day, I am more satisfied than I am at just about any other time of my work week. It feels so good. And I think to myself, how good must it have felt? How good would it feel to be healing the sick and casting out demons and seeing people repentant all over the place as you preach? What an encouraging thing to have happen. But when you think about it and you realize that this is flesh and blood, it kind of breaks down after a while. It has only so much stamina. It goes so far. There's a little interim section in here, and then down in verse 30, the thing in here between about John the Baptist is not terribly relevant to this. It says in verse 30, the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus and told him all the things that they had done and what they had taught. I can imagine that. They were so full of what happened. You think that story is impressive? Wait till you hear mine. As they topped one another with story after story after story of people who were healed and sick people who were all of a sudden well, of sinners who had turned their life around. And he said to them, come you yourselves apart to a desert place and rest a while. Come on, let's go away and rest a while. There is a time to work and there is a time to rest, even when the work you are doing is God's work. Now, I want to ask the question that naturally follows on this, why? Why? Well, I'm flesh and blood. One of the reasons why. One of the reasons is that the old body will wear out. We can only handle so much adrenaline for so long and things start breaking down. And so the why of the physical aspect of the rest is not that hard to come by. Why, though? Is there more than just this physical aspect? I think there is. And I think it's important for us to understand it. He said that he wanted to take them aside to a place and rest a while, for there were many coming and going, so much so that they had no leisure so much as to eat. And they departed into a desert place by a ship privately. And the people saw them departing, and many people knew him and ran about afoot there of all the cities and outwent them and came together to them. And Jesus, when he had come out, saw many people and was moved with compassion upon them because they were like sheep having a shepherd to be, and he began to, sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. And the day was nearly over, and it's just one thing after another with Jesus and the disciples. Finally, he put them into a boat and sent them out to sea while he stayed there and talked to these people a while longer. He got rid of them and got them away from the crowds and sent them off because he knew that otherwise they would never get any rest, just as he himself had great difficulty in ever getting any rest. Now, I really think that this is an important thing because I believe that apart from the fact that the body needs rest, that a man or a woman needs time alone with themselves and with God in order to hear the still small voice of God within you, in order to be able to think your way through the problems that you face, the difficulties you are struggling with, your own frustrations, your own aggravations, your own problems, the things from the past that may haunt you that you have not been able to work out. Every one of us needs time to draw near to God. For the truth is that if all you ever do is work, you will grow weaker. That unless you rest, unless you have a quiet moment, unless you can spend that time with God, spiritual growth is not possible. It won't happen. Some years ago, I was a very busy executive in another religious organization. I was a vice president in charge of their foreign operations, had a big corner office up in the top floor of the administration building up there, and lots and lots and lots of work to do. And spent most of my time fighting brush fires. In other words, management by crisis. If something went wrong over here, I would go over there and I would fix it. And then something went wrong over here, and I'd go over there and I would fix that. And I would get on an airplane and fly to South Africa. I'd get on an airplane and go to Canada. I'd get on an airplane and go to England. I'd get on an airplane and go to Australia. And I made 3 around-the-world trips during this period of time, just covering different problems and things that were out there. Well, the man who was sort of a senior vice president in the organization at that time, one of the senior vice presidents, organized for those of us who had those jobs a set of management workshops. There were about, I think, maybe 8 or 9 of us in those workshops with a real professional. And he gave us an assignment. There were 2 successive weeks in which we had an assignment which was extremely useful. The first week, he wanted us to write down on the 10-minute segments everything we did the whole week. He wanted us to log it in. So if you did something for, inside this 10-minute segment, he wanted us to write it down. That was a real challenge. The second week, after we'd done that the first week, he said, we're going to do this again. I'm going to ease up on you a bit. It only has to be every 15 minutes. And during this week, I want you to take 1 hour when you do absolutely nothing except think. Now, what this served to do for me was to underline, double underline, put it in bold and italics, that prior to that time, I hardly ever took any time to think. Because the week before was a normal pattern of my life and the way my job went and the way I worked. That week was not, because in that week there was a block in which I did nothing except think, and there was no other block like that in my life for just a very long time before it or a very long time after it. Most of us don't really like to think very much. We try to avoid thought. Now, I realize you think all the time. You think you're sitting there thinking about what I'm telling you right now, but that's not what I'm talking about when I say think. I'm a lot closer when I use the word think to what David is talking about when he talks about meditation, which basically means you think and you don't do anything else except think for this period of time. And your mind is in focus on what you're thinking about, whatever that may be, for that period of time. It is something that we don't do very well. In fact, we try to find ways not to expose ourselves unnecessarily to thought. I mean, we will turn on the television set. We will take a book. We will, even if you go in to visit many of your people's bathrooms, you will find, where's the reading room in your house? Because not even there do you want to be alone with your thoughts. It's a crude example. I only use it, though, just to illustrate to you what I'm talking about. We go to incredible lengths not to have time to think. That particular assignment by that man on that occasion was a revolution for me. I was struck this morning in the first presentation. He was saying that sometime there's going to come a time when each of us is going to have to stand alone before God. Do you realize you can do that tonight? You don't have to wait for the judgment day. You don't have to wait till you're on the sea of glass with your knees knocking together and saying, I wonder what the Lord's going to have to say to me. That you can be alone with God tonight. Take a little time before you go to bed. Go to a private place. Go to your closet. Kneel by your bed and be alone with God. You can be right there, alone with Him, almost any time. I really think that we are afraid of being alone with God. Almost as much as we're afraid of being alone with ourselves. It would seem at least that way. Now, there is a curious argument that I heard this last year that I had not really heard before. And the argument was that, the Sabbath day is a day, the idea that I want to take the Sabbath day as a day of complete rest, where I can sleep late, I can restore my body, I can spend time in reading and study the Bible, and I can have a day that's to myself. The argument was being advanced by some in some quarters that, this is selfish. And the Sabbath day ought to be a day when you abandon your own work and you can work hard all day for God, and you can visit the sick and visit the fatherless, and you can go to an old folks home, and a whole long line of work that you can do. You can get up early on the Sabbath and work all day long on the Sabbath. And the net result of this is going to be that you're going to be working, busy, 7 days a week. When do you find the time to listen to that still, small voice of God in your life? And I want you to understand something. It's not good enough to take this time in 5-minute segments. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It is that long period of quiet. It is that long period of silence. It is that long period of solitude in which, with the process of time, as your mind works, that you can begin to find answers, that you can begin to work your way through difficulties, and that you can find your way back to God, hear His voice, find His will, and find within yourself the resources to pursue that will. For just as you find physical strength out of rest, you can find spiritual strength and courage out of rest as well. And so I think it's really worth us thinking, yeah, it's right to do good on the Sabbath. And yes, there's no reason why we should shun to visit a sick person on the Sabbath day. Even as Jesus, when He came across a person who was sick on the Sabbath day, did not hesitate to heal the person on that day. But I think it's a serious mistake to begin to think of the Sabbath day as strictly another day of work. It's just a day for God's work, because if you never find that time for communion with Him, where is the meditation? Where is the time to read the Bible slowly, in a leisurely manner, to let it soak into your consciousness, to ask those difficult questions, to find those answers for yourself? Where is that going to come from if you can't find some time for yourself? But, we chase after things of, if all we accomplish by visiting the sick and visiting the fatherless and visiting the poor and doing all these good works, if what that accomplishes is to keep us from being alone, to keep us from being silent before God, to keep us from being alone with Him, if it's just an excuse to keep running, because for many of us, that's what we are addicted to running. We are going to run, and we can't stand being still. And when we are still, we think there's something wrong. And when we're still, we feel guilty. When we sit down, we feel that we're, I was very interested in some of the things that were said this morning about the needs that we have, that we start filling with the wrong things. First person I ever read advance that concept in a way that it clicked with me was C.S. Lewis. And I think it was in Mere Christianity. If not, it was another one of his books. I think the one that is A Pilgrim's Regress was interesting in that regard, where he explored the idea of this emptiness, this longing that is in man, that we try to fill. And he, in his book, took the person through different things like, it was a takeoff, I think, on Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. As a man kept seeking for this island that he got a glimpse of out there somewhere that was so beautiful and that somehow, some way he could get to. And he never really, the island was a metaphor for that emptiness in man that was designed into man. That you actually were designed by God with a hole in you. And there is only one thing that really fits that hole. It's God. And we try to fill it with alcohol, with drugs, with work, with friends, with parties, with God's work. And for those of us who are in the ministry, who sometimes will go for months without ever having a Sabbath day off, we really need to jerk ourselves up short and say, what are you doing? Where is your mind? What are you thinking about here? For we could get so involved in ministry, so involved in work, that we never have any time for God. Does that sound funny? Sound strange? It did to me. It did to me, but I'm beginning to understand it. I'm beginning to grasp it. I even saw an interesting book by Chuck Swindoll recently, who I gather from reading between the lines in this book has gone through a personal crisis of his own that made him realize that there came a time when he had to stop, had to slow down, and could not work 7 days a week as he had done before. Even the work of God, pursued without rest, will wear you away and will ultimately burn you up. Or maybe the modern term is burn you out. And it grows. I want to try to introduce you to a little tiny thought here for you to take away and think about. To some extent, it grows from a false assumption. It grows from an assumption that the success of the work of God somehow depends on me. Now, I know that the visiting of Mrs. McGillicuddy, who's over here alone by herself, does depend on me. And I know that there are many little things and works and jobs and tasks that are mine to do that I really must do. But it's so easy for me to make that next little step in which I begin to assume that I am somehow irreplaceable or that I cannot be replaced in the work of God. Someone once said, if you ever feel that way about it, just go get yourself a bucket of water and put it down, stare at it for a moment, then put your finger in the water, hold it there for about 5 or 6 seconds, and pull it out. And look at the hole you leave. For indeed, it's about like that. And you think that your absence from the scene in God's work would leave some giant hole there. It's like Elijah. Poor old Elijah, on Mount Carmel, he's up there and calls down fire from heaven, and hours later, he's fleeing for his life. And he gets himself down in the desert somewhere, and he says to God, oh God, I'm the only one that's left. They've all forsaken you. They've all gone after idols, and poor pitiful me, I am the only one. And God says, oh, get off it. I have reserved for me 7,000 men that have not bowed the knee to Baal. You are not the only one left. It's important to me to know that. And I think it's just as important to you to know that. That if I disappear off the planet tomorrow, God's work will not die. In fact, it did hardly be missed at all because I'm still here and all these cassette tapes you people have got in your closets around the countryside. So I can't go away if I want to, it seems. But you know what I mean. There are none of us that are irreplaceable, no matter how much we think we are, no matter how much we look that way to one another. And we need to be careful about that. We need to be very, very careful about that. You cannot also, another thing that you need to understand, you cannot really help others when you yourself are in need of help. Perhaps the best metaphor I can think of this is Dart's first law for helping the poor. You may want to write this down. This is an original, I think. I never heard anybody else say it. Dart's first law of helping the poor is, don't be poor. For if you are poor, you're not going to be of much value at all in helping the poor, are you? No resources. So, this brings us to Dart's first law of giving people help spiritually. You can't be spiritually impoverished yourself and be of any spiritual help to other people. And my corollary of that is this, that if you never rest, if you are never silent before God, if you never seek solitude with Him, you will become spiritually impoverished, for you are abandoning and staying away from, maybe even running from, the only source of spiritual power that there is. Your tanks will get empty, and you can be of no help whatsoever to anyone else. You can't help people with their pain until you've dealt with yours. I really thought that analogy this morning of the filling up of the great empty place in the life was so important. Turn back, if you would, with me to one of the most familiar, famous, well-known, most sung scriptures in the Bible. You have any idea where I'm going? One of the most familiar scriptures in the Bible, one of the most sung scriptures anywhere in the Bible. Well, I said most sung. I don't think that's been sung as much. Psalm 23. Oh, we got 3 of them in the hymnal, for crying out loud. 3 versions of the 23rd Psalm in the hymnal. Now, I know you love this psalm. I know you've read it many times. You have stood in church and sung it many times. It is a beautiful psalm. The Lord is my shepherd. I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. He restores my soul. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Well, Lord, that sure sounds wonderful, but it just doesn't work that way with me. The Lord is my shepherd, but I find myself often and almost continually in want. I don't exactly lie down in green pastures. I find I'm lying in the dust or on dirt or on gravel, and it's downright uncomfortable. The waters in my life, far from being still, are storm-tossed and turbulent. They're whitecapping almost every day. My soul is almost empty. He leads me behind in the paths of righteousness. Well, I find that righteousness so often flees from me in my life, and the things that I would, I don't do, and the things that I don't want to do, I wind up doing. Yea, I live in the valley of the shadow of death, and I'm afraid most of the time. You are with me? I hope you are. I believe you are. But sometimes I wonder. Goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. Would that it were so, for often it is evil, and sometimes I feel unforgiven, and I think that God may not consider my weakness. And I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever? Well, only by His mercy, for I don't deserve anything close to that. I think what I just did was probably a lot closer to the 23rd Psalm that many people live in their lives. It may sound familiar to you in places where you go through there. But I want us to stop and take a look at this psalm just for a moment, maybe with fresh eyes. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He makes me to lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside the still waters. But how can I go to the green pasture? How can I find the still waters if I do not slow down long enough so that the Lord can tell me where they are? If I will not let Him take my hand. You know how often you have little children who are rowdy and they're hyper and they're bouncing off the walls, you know, you can't get them to go, take my hand, and you can't get them to hold, you try to hold on, you have to be strong to hold on to their hand. You're afraid you're going to pull the little arm out of its socket, right? Because of the way they're tugging and pulling, they're worse than dogs. Do you suppose it's possible that the reason why we are not in this situation of lying in green pastures, we're out there lying in the dirt and the gravel, is because we wouldn't hold God's hand? Because we wouldn't stay still long enough for Him to lead us to it? The reason why the waters in our life are so turbulent and white-capped and waves are tossing and we're scared to death of them half the time is because we won't stay still. Because we ourselves are turbulent. Because we are agitating, and because we will not stop and stay still and not move, we don't even realize that we are probably the source of most of the agitation that whips the water up. Simply because we won't stop. We won't be still. We won't put our hand in God's hand. And the song, "Put Your Hand in the Hand of the Man," is so frivolous that it doesn't, to me, it says absolutely nothing. The 23rd Psalm says it all. That unless you are willing to slow down and stop and be silent, be still, then you cannot be led to the green pasture or beside those waters. He restores my soul. How can He when you keep emptying it out all the time? How can He when you won't stand still? Have you ever tried to refuel a moving car? How do you restore a person who will not take time for you, who will not listen to you, who will not stay put when you're trying to explain something to them? How can you? God is almost put in a position of having to chase you around, having to reach behind you, grabbing for you all the time like a parent for an unruly child, and He's not going to do that. He is simply not going to do that. He will allow you to run until you're out of gas, until you're lying in the dirt, until the gravel's in your teeth, and then He will say, "Ready to listen? Do you want to know? Do you care how you got where you are? Are you interested in knowing whether there was another way? I'll tell you, but you're going to have to sit still for a while. Rest. Come away. Let's be together. Let's talk. You talk to me for a while. Well, Lord, I've talked to you and you never tell me anything back. I'm not through listening yet. Keep talking. You talk to me. You haven't said it all. You haven't said nearly enough. He leads me in the paths of righteousness for His name's sake." Well, I would have to say in my lifetime that I have described an S curve across the path of righteousness so many times that it's discouraging. I am in the path of righteousness every once in a while on my way from one side of unrighteousness to the other. And what I really need to do is when I get in the right place, I need to stop and listen and heed and let God take me by the hand and lead me. I guess in a lot of ways what most of us need is to learn how to heal, although that's not really what God wants from us. My dog not only knows how to heal, she knows which side of me she's supposed to be on. She's not at all comfortable walking on my right hand. She is supposed to be on the left because that's where she was trained to be. Would God that maybe we could learn some of those lessons as to which side of God we're supposed to be on. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. You know, I wonder how many times, though, we are in the valley of the shadow of death because we chose to be, because we made a wrong turn, because we weren't listening, because we wouldn't be directed by God. But finding myself in the shadow of death when it's not my fault, when I didn't put myself there, maybe even for the sake of the name of God, I will not be afraid because He is with me. But it is the knowledge that God is with us that allows us to not be afraid, isn't it? How else can we possibly not be afraid? God's rod that He can beat off our enemies with, His staff that He can protect us with, will comfort us. But only if we know He's there. And the only way you can know He's there is if you talk to Him and you allow Him to be a part of your life. And you are quiet enough that you may hear His voice, for His voice is still and it is small. He does not wish to overpower you. He wants you to lean forward when He speaks and when He's trying to talk to you. And you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil. My cup runs over. Yeah, that sounds good. I'm afraid a lot of times my cup is almost empty. And the reason why it's almost empty is because I have not stood still long enough for God to fill it up. Goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. But I got to go there, and I got to stay put, and I've got to listen and respond to Him and develop a relationship with Him. And I can't do any of that when I am so busy I have no time for Him. No time for His thoughts. No time for the Bible. No time for prayer. No time for meditation. No time for thought. And so on it goes. Now, I probably have not told you a single thing this afternoon that you don't already know. Really. But at least for a few moments, I have made you sit still and listen to it. You have had to sit here. And most of you have sort of listened, and you've kind of got the idea now that it's beginning to settle into your mind. So you say, yeah, I think I see what he is trying to say. I think, where this goes in my life. I need to slow down. I must take time. I must talk to God. Beautiful old song. I mean, I heard Bronson sing this once, and it brought me to tears. The old song, I Must Tell Jesus. I must tell Jesus. I cannot bear this burden alone. But you got to slow down. You can't do it at 100 miles an hour going down the interstate to tell Jesus. You can't tell Jesus about it out here on Lakeshore Drive in the middle of 8 o'clock in the morning traffic. Praying when you're in your car driving around town is not good enough. Telling Jesus about it, while you're actually doing the ironing is not good enough. He wants all of you, all of your attention, all of your heart, all of your mind. And the power that can come your way when you have time for God and are willing to take time for God is something beyond, I think, your capacity to even imagine. I must tell Jesus, I cannot bear this burden alone. Well, His time is your time.